So I'm delighted today to be joined by Professor Belinda Tynan, who's currently the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Education and Vice President at RMIT University down there in Melbourne. Prior to that, Belinda was the PVC Learning and Teaching at the Open University in the UK. In addition to that, she's the recent past President of the ACODE, or International Council of Open and Distance Education, and is currently on the Board of Governors of the Commonwealth of Learning, or COL. Belinda has the very rare and dubious privilege, or honour I should say, of having been my boss on 2 occasions at 2 different universities, and she may be joined by Eddie the Seal Point Siamese any moment now, so we'll see how that goes. But Belinda, open education, you've had a bit of connection with that over the years. What does open education mean to you?
Well, Michael, thank you for that fantastic introduction. I don't think it was dubious. I think we had some fantastic times together, and it's such a joy and a pleasure to be here with you today. And thank you for the invitation to talk about this. Yes, well, I'm really passionate about it, and there's a lot we could say. It's a really big topic. Open education resources, open education practice, you know, there are so many definitions. And probably for me, I sort of lean more into the space of open educational practices, and that I see open education resources as being part of that sort of matrix that supports that. And so if I had a vision for what the world could look like in education, then we'd probably all sit in that space of being around open educational practice. Obviously, you know, it doesn't always suit the models of funding, for example, and regulation. And especially in the context here in Australia, I think you would find, because of the way that the higher education sector is structured, that it would be very difficult probably for all organisations to feel they would want to embrace OEP in a sense. But certainly aspects of one's display of openness would certainly could be embraced much more by our sector here. So
in our sector, does that mean publishing in open journals, or open textbooks? What do you think that actually in practice means?
Yeah, well, it could be a whole range of things, you know, because when you talk about open education practice, it doesn't just cover off, you know, developing open education resources. As you say, it could be about being open in the way we publish our research and, you know, open research, but it could also be about the openness of the governance of an organisation as well, you know, and making sure that, you know, like committee notes and you know, anything to do with governance is open and is transparent too. It becomes a mission of an organisation to practice open educational practice. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So it's not just resources, not just research, it's the whole system then, you know, sort of becomes open in that sense. Yeah, so it could also be down to, sorry, I interrupted you there, but it could also be, you know, openness in terms of admissions. You know, so because I worked at the Open University in the UK, as you said, and there was an openness for admissions. And so you didn't need an ATAR score per se. You could have one, but you didn't need one. So there's an openness of admissions as well.
Okay, cool. So, I mean, that goes down to professional development resources. I mean, like at Griffith, we try and make as many as possible open to the world, so other people can benefit from that. Anyway, sorry.
Well, let me just, you know, like speak to that a bit, because certainly when you think about how public institutions are funded, you know, part of that premise or philosophy that OEP sits on is that, well, if you're publicly funded, then there's a right to, you know, for all to share, you know, that knowledge in some way, or share that resource. And so you might logically say, well, given we get quite a lot of public funding into our institutions, then if we're developing resources, that there's probably a lot of inefficiency and duplication in the system. And you might expect those things to be open for others to use and to share. You know, which is something that, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit later in this podcast, but it's something which in other countries around the world, they have embraced more fully than we have yet in Australia.
Yeah. So in Australia, a Western country, you know, a developed country, is there some kind of moral responsibility on us, or we don't think it was that too binary? It was a too kind of Western Eastern type of...
You've probably answered your question. It's probably a bit too binary. You know, it's a bit like we sometimes talk about the arguments between the North and the South, you know, the rich North and the poorer South, you know, and that You know, we could be doing much more, you know, in our own practice to be supporting the world in a sense. And we've got the Sustainable Development Goals there, and particularly number 4 around education, which I think all of us are leaning into more and more. But there is potentially an argument to say that, well, okay, perhaps the rich north is able to, you know, provide more access in terms of the openness of resources that can be used in those contexts. I guess one of the things we have to be a little bit careful about is, you know, there's a lot of debate and a lot of argument around, you know, language, the languages that resources are in, and also knowledge systems. And so, you know, the great Western knowledge base may not be culturally fit for purpose in other nations and other contexts. So we've got to be a little bit careful there. There's not a colonialistic view of what the West can do for the South or the North or the East. You know what I mean? It's a delicate balance on that one.
Yes, but I suppose we by making what we have open, it's then up to them how they choose to use that.
Well, of course, and you know, and there are potentially things which are similar enough, you know, that people can pick up and they can rehash and rematch and put together in ways that, you know, can suit their purposes. And my work with the Commonwealth of Learning, for example, is really based and founded on open education resources and these open educational practices, which enables, you know, it enables others and provides access into knowledges, and there are many knowledges in our world for a variety of contexts as well.
Yeah. I mean, not the least in our context, our Indigenous knowledges that we tend not to.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So how do you think we can change the mindsets here in Australia, or Australasia, I should say, I suppose, you know, to move us into a more open mindset?
I guess this has always been really curious for me, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, that Australia feels to me really a bit out on the edge. We're on the outer of a global movement. So open education resources and OEP, you know, it's been 15 years or more now talking about this. You've had major movements across the world, you know, in many countries in this space. You've got, you know, open stacks, textbooks. You know, I could give you huge lists of all what's available in there, but Australia seems to have either not participated in the conversation, hasn't had the mechanism to participate in it, hasn't found it has a relevance, like it doesn't ring true to them in some way, doesn't connect with them. It just sort of feels like we've just not looked at it, and we haven't had a conversation about it. And so I think that if Australia wanted to lean into this space more so, then I think we need to develop our own understanding of what it could mean for us, you know, and how we could potentially work together more, how we could be more collaborative, how we could be more open in these spaces. Right. I think we're also really challenged by a publisher model, you know, and that is it's quite difficult for our academic and teaching staff. And I know some of the small movements that we've been doing at RMIT, it can be quite difficult, you know, working with an academic staff member who has for many years, you know, been working with a publisher, for example, and then it's not a cheap thing either, you know. So just because it's open education resource, it's not that it doesn't cost. There is a cost associated with these things, and that's both in time and knowledge. But bringing people on a journey is definitely, I think, where we want to go. And I think the most powerful argument I've used at my institution for this is that you add up the cost of the textbooks that the student has to pay for their subjects for 12 months. Yeah. And in one of my colleges, we added up, you know, the entire first year list of textbooks that students would possibly have to have as compulsory reading. $6,000. Now, when you add that up and you think, well, actually, that's a huge additional cost for our students, and we're really talking first year texts. And so we've managed in that area in particular to reduce that cost to students by stepping into that OER space. And that's probably a first step, really. There's that conversation. We've also engaged with our academic board on this matter. And so we've been taking into our academic board discussion papers around, well, what does OEP mean? What does it mean for research? What does that mean for learning and teaching? And how would we or could we and want we, you know, to embrace that as well?
Yeah. So
I don't know, what about you, Michael? I mean, you've noticed that too, haven't you, in the sector, that Australia has been slow, hasn't it, to sort of put this up?
Yeah. I mean, there are those who openly practice it, but they're not the majority by any means.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you've got those passionate academics and teachers who just really lean into it, you know, and they're quite hidden, you know. I know when we did that call in our university to find out, well, who was, you know, working in this space, we were surprised, you know, who sort of came out of the woodwork and who had a passion for it.
I mean, there needs to be some kind of weighting put onto that if we're serious about it. So, I mean, we're all looking for the A-star journals, but there's no open A-star journals.
Yeah.
Unless there's some compensation for that in terms of, okay, well, this is open now. And so that has a value.
Yeah, it's interesting that the currencies that we currently use for, you know, academic promotion and, you know, deciding what excellence looks like hasn't taken into account openness yet.
Yes,
you know, it's still based on what you're saying, that, you know, a publisher model, etc. in that space in particular. But yeah, developing a currency where it's valued. So within our promotion criteria, we do have, you get sort of, you don't get points, but if you can demonstrate that you've, you know, worked on, you know, an OER of some kind in your curriculum development, etc., that gets recognised. It has a currency. But I think at that broader level, you know, at an enterprise level, you know, across the sector, until we get a currency to this, then people are, you know, it's not going to drive the behaviours that we might think could be good for our sector.
Yeah. Well, just in concluding then, is there something you'd want to say that might encourage people in this space?
I think don't be scared of the licensing, because I think that people come undone a bit when they look at, you know, the licensing side of it. And that's quite a complicated area, you know, the Creative Commons, etc. And share alike, and sort of understanding that would be to don't be scared of that. You know, the best people to talk about it to are usually your librarians. They usually understand that really well. And I think the other thing I wouldn't be so worried about is picking up content that is an open education resource, you know, different, you know, open textbooks and things like that. If you take the time to go through it, you only have to do it once. You know, you can validate in a sense what that knowledge and where it's come from, etc. Because a lot of people are worried about the standard of things, the quality. So if you take the time to do that, you know, you need to have a look at it. But look, I'd encourage everyone, you know, especially in their learning and teaching practice and in their research practice, to be thinking about, you know, how we are funded as a society and what our accountability is as a public good.
Cool.
Is that all right?
That's fantastic. Yeah, no, look, thanks so much for joining us, Belinda. It was a great joy to talk with you again after quite a while. You've been a good friend of ACODE over the years and presented a number of times at our events, and thanks so much. And we look forward to continuing the relationship. So thanks.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure, Michael. And thank you again for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. I think ACODE is one of those really enduring organisations in Australia who play an incredible role in the sector. So you all keep doing what you're doing too, and you all have my support.
Cool. Thanks, mate.